so I'm going to give it another minute as folks join us. Okay, it's 2:01. I'm going to respect our time and go ahead and start. It looks like our Zoom room is full and everyone else will be joining us on our YouTube link, so I'm going to go ahead. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Centering Individuals with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities During Crises and Emergencies. Our presenter today is Justice Shorter. Justice is a national expert on disability-inclusive disaster protections, emergency management, and humanitarian crises and conflicts. Justice served as a disability integration advisor with the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, deploying frequently to disaster areas across America and its territories. She's also the co-creator of a celebrated framework for applying disability justice approaches to disaster assistance, an emergency management method that acknowledges histories of harm, centers intersectionality, and prioritizes leadership by Black, Indigenous, and people of color with disabilities. With a steadfast commitment to international development and inclusive humanitarian assistance, Justice continues to participate in ongoing projects as a global advisor and trainer. My name is Kristen Dahl, and on behalf of the Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities National Training Center, I would like to thank you for taking the time to be here today. Please visit our social media and website, mhddcenter.org, for resources related to mental health and developmental disabilities. Next slide, please, Brandon. We have a few housekeeping items to go over. If you are joining us on Zoom, the controls are located at the bottom bar of your Zoom window. Please use the chat box if you have any comments or technical issues, and we will do our best to assist you. Please use the Q&A to submit questions to our presenter. We will read your questions to Justice as time allows throughout the presentation. There is a hand-raising feature you can use if you need assistance from the MHDD team. Other than those presenting the webinar, everyone is muted and camera access is turned off. You do not need to be concerned with muting yourself or turning off your camera. This webinar is being live captioned. You can turn on captions in the Zoom window by clicking the CC button on the menu and selecting Show Subtitles. You can also change the size of the caption text by selecting Subtitle Settings. The webinar is also being broadcast live on YouTube. If you are joining us on YouTube, please add your questions and comments to the live chat on the right-hand side of your screen. Thank you to the Kentucky Office of Vocational Rehabilitation for providing ASL interpreting services. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel and the MHDD website. A PDF of the presentation slides will be available as well. We will be sending out an email following the webinar with an evaluation. We ask you to complete the evaluation so we can improve future webinars. The email will also include instructions on how to receive continuing education credits. For those of you just joining us, welcome to the webinar, Centering Individuals with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities During Crises and Emergencies. Thank you for being here. I'll now turn it over to Justice Shorter.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be with you here today. I am so excited to be in community and have this conversation about how we can better center individuals with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities throughout crises, humanitarian concerns, disasters, emergencies, pandemics. So I'm thrilled that all of you decided to show up and spend some time with us this afternoon. Kristen, I just want to confirm, are we on the grounding slide?
We are, yes.
All right, awesome. So I wanted to ground the conversation a little bit here today. First, let me just describe myself. My name is Justice Shorter. I am a Black blind lesbian woman. I am currently in my apartment in Washington, D.C., and I am excited to go over today's presentation. I wanted to acknowledge, though, why we are here. We are here, hopefully, because you came to this workshop with the belief that you could do something to impact the way individuals with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities are treated, or the experiences that they have, or that you have yourself as someone with an intellectual disability or developmental disability has throughout disasters, and that you could do something in a very actionable way to contribute to how we prepare for, respond to, and recover from disaster. So hopefully you have come to this session with that in mind. I want you guys to kind of express a commitment to who we are here to center, which I've mentioned already. I want you to examine where you enter. Are you entering this space as an advocate, as an activist, as a provider, as a parent? And explore what you would like to do with this information, right? Are you going to just sit with this information or sit through this session, or are you going to figure out how you can actively engage as soon as this call is over? Because that is what I'm hoping you will do. I will do my very best to make as much space for all of the participants with us today. So I will be asking you throughout our session to share some of your comments and your stories and any ways that you relate to the content. If you could share that in the Q&A box, that way you can do it in a way that is semi-confidential. Or if you would like, you can share that information in the chat box. I would also love it if all of you can help provide collective access for one another. That's one of the principles of disability justice, is collective access. And I want to put that in practice this afternoon. So if you have a link or a resource that might be useful, if you have the answer to a question that somebody has posed to me, but because there's hundreds of you and only one of me, that I'm unable to get to, but you know the answer, or you have a similar experience, or you have just some feedback, some reflections, please feel free to share it with those individuals who have inquired. I want to make sure that I uplift and I amplify the fact that many of you come to this session with a wide variety of experiences and expertise, and I think that that should be acknowledged, and there should be space made for that. So let's do that today collectively. This presentation is not set in stone, so please be aware that the way I present it today will surely be different than the way I present it in a month or two, because the idea is for the content to be ever evolving in its nature. I also want to just mention a few content warnings. And some places in the presentation, I will mention things like domestic violence, genocide, rape, abuse. I won't go into those things in any heavy detail whatsoever, but there will be the mention of those things with regards to disasters and emergencies. I also want to be clear that we may not have enough time to get through this whole deck, and I want us to be okay with that. We may have to go a little bit longer than 2 o'clock if you need to jump off. This recording or this session will indeed be recorded, but I did not want to quickly rush through this content, because doing that also impedes access for many individuals who are in attendance. So I want us to actually kind of go through and the different portions of today's presentations bit by bit in a way that's conducive to several different learning styles. And then I also want to, like I said before, make enough space to casually revert over to Christian and have her read aloud some of your comments, so that in questions, so that we're not saving all of that to the last 5 minutes and trying to squeeze in dozens of questions into 2 or 3 minute periods. I don't want to do that. So we're going to try to do things a little bit differently here today. With that being said, I hope everyone can take a collective breath. I speak rather quickly, so I'm going to try my best to slow that part down too. And let's jump into the content. Next slide. So I wanted to start us off here by examining the legal lens. Every single workshop I do, I always start with this, because having been a disability integration advisor who works in disaster and emergency context, I have frequently been met with this idea that people are doing me a favor. Other people who work in emergency management or in the disaster space, you're doing me a favor by including folks with disabilities. It is not a favor. It is not a charitable consideration. It is the law. And so I always like to start off with those fundamental and foundational points by acknowledging a few of the laws that make it, or a few of the laws that are related to disability rights and disasters and emergencies, and how these different attributes are enshrined in law. So let's talk about access in that way. As it relates to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that is going to be Title II, which focuses on local and state services, right? And we can also think about this in terms of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, right? So I always think about this in terms of the Lion King, kind of everything the light touches is your kingdom. When we talk about those federal dollars, everything that federal dollar touches must be made accessible for individuals with disabilities. But when we're talking about the ADA, that is more of local and state. When we're talking about local emergency managers or state actors who are implementing emergency management programs on a state level. So that needs to be made accessible in that way. And then also if they are receiving federal dollars, right? So even if it's a nonprofit organization or some sort of not or voluntary organization, if they are providing disaster services and if they have received funding from a federal entity or state entity, then we need to make sure that those services and those resources are going to be made accessible for individuals with disabilities. I often in this section too, just like to bring up the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, because sometimes it's really left out of conversations around disasters and emergencies. And that's really an issue because often children are displaced as well. And so we want to make sure that they have access to their individualized education plans and any other sort of resources that they were having access to prior to the disaster as well, right? So we want to make sure even if they are displaced, they still have access to those supports. And that of course includes during a pandemic as well, right? So we've had so many examples of students with disabilities who have not received access during remote learning. So we want to make sure that that's always at the forefront of our minds. And then lastly, state laws where applicable. So sometimes you'll have some regulatory measures that have been put in place by a state that's not universal across the country, but it's state specific, or it is specific to a particular county. And if there are ordinances or laws or regulatory measures that are in place that are related to disasters and emergencies, we want to make sure that people with disabilities are thought about during that process, right? All right, so that's the legal lens. Next slide. So we started off here talking about disability rights, right? So I wanted to kind of root us in this rights-based framework, but now I also kind of want to transition to the framework that we'll be using pretty much throughout the rest of this section. And that is a focus on disability justice. So disability justice differs from disability rights. Whereas disability rights primarily focuses on laws and policies, disability justice kind of picks up where disability rights leaves off. And it was created by a group of queer, disabled women of color who were connected through this performance group called SINS Invalid. And these are individuals, now I'll just name a couple because I think it's important to say their names: Patty Burns, Stacey Park Milburn, who we lost earlier this year, as well as Mia Mingus. And we had additional contributions from folks like Eli Clare and Leroy Moore, just real luminaries in this space who have done tremendous amounts of work. But they created this framework of disability justice that consists of 10 basic principles. And we'll get into those principles right now. Next slide. All right, so these 10 principles, I would just want you to keep these all in mind. I'm not going to go through all of them right now because I will be referencing them as we go throughout our presentation today, but I'm just going to note a few of them here because I think it's important to kind of frame it a bit so that you understand it. Intersectionality is one of the principles of disability justice. And so I want to acknowledge that intersectionality is not the same thing as diversity. Whereas diversity is the recognition and the celebration of difference, intersectionality more so focuses on power and privilege and marginalization and systems of oppression and how those overlap and intersect in ways that continue to disenfranchise or marginalize individuals, specifically individuals of color, right? But whereas you could have a privilege in one area, let's say you can have privileges associated with your whiteness, you can also have disadvantages or oppressions related to the fact that you have autism or that you have a learning disability or that you have an intellectual disability, right? So intersectionality recognizes that all of these different components very much influences the way that someone moves through the world. And if you have the chance, I would highly recommend that you all check out the book, All the Weight of Our Dreams. And that was written and put together by the Autism Women and Non-Binary Network, as well as Lydia XZ Brown. So if you have the time to check that out, it really does speak to some of those intersectional experiences in terms of folks who are people of color who also have autism. So again, that's the book, All the Weight of Our Dreams on Living Racialized Autism. I am a book nerd, so I'm going to be peppering our conversation with tons of book recommendations today. I hope you guys are with me on it. If you have good recommendations, go ahead and throw those those in the chat. I would love to hear about them. And hopefully others will as well. I also want to just focus in on the second principle here, which is leadership by the most impacted. We'll be discussing today the effort and the push to make sure that individuals with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities are not just storytellers, and although that's really important, but we also want to make sure that folks are decision makers as well, right? And have a role in how we design and also how we implement our disaster plans and our emergency plans. And so we want to make sure that they are at the center of this conversation and not just casually considered or consulted with when it's deemed necessary, or to placate an individual because people have gotten upset after being excluded for so long, but it is centrally connected to our collective survival to make sure that folks with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities are a part of this conversation from the very beginning. So that's leadership by the most impacted, super important. I also just want to recognize sustainability. So in order to make sure that the changes that we put in place, if we're trying to change systems and we're trying to make sure that we learn from our past mistakes, we want to do that in a way that is sustainable. We want to do that in a way that doesn't just keep repeating itself disaster after disaster, which can cause additional harm. It can cause additional problems. And so we want to make sure that whatever efforts we put in place, that it is going to be sustained over time, and ask ourselves and ask our communities, what do we need to do to make sure that this effort can be sustained? I work with so many groups who tell me, well, we worked on that a ton, but after Cheryl left or after David left, all of that information left with them. All of the different community programs that they put in place, all of the different outreach and engagement work that they were doing with folks with intellectual disabilities, all of that's gone now because this one individual left, right? So we want to make sure that our efforts can be sustained over time, right? We also want to understand interdependence and collective liberation, which is really important. So that means that we need to have conversations around folks with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities who are a part of carceral systems, right? So none of us are free until we're all free. So we want to make sure that when we're planning for disasters and emergencies, we think about folks who are incarcerated. We think about folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are in ICE detention centers. We think about juveniles with disabilities and intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities who are in youth detention centers. Are we having conversations about what happens to them during the disaster? What happens to them when they're displaced in an emergency context? What happens to them when the world is struck by a global pandemic? We want to make sure that they're involved in that conversation and that we hear those voices. We go behind the bars and beyond the bars to make sure that they are not forgotten, right? They are a part of our narrative. They're a part of our strategy. They are a part of how we survive. Next slide. So why do we need disability justice and emergency management? Well, as I said, disability justice is not the same as emergency management, but justice isn't always achieved via the legal system. Not everyone has equal and equitable access to legal supports, right? A lot of the laws that I mentioned before, ADA, the 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, a lot of those laws are complaint driven. And so not everybody has the time, the energy, or the capacity to deal with protracted legal battles, right? So disability justice helps us to remember that multiple tools and tactics are needed to help communities survive and thrive. There is also collective trauma that has been done to marginalized communities and emergency management practices, and that has to be addressed at systemic levels. And this recognition is reflected in disability justice principles such as wholeness, right? So your physical health is impacted by your mental health. Your mental health is impacted by your physical health. And we need to recognize that all of those things are intertwined when we think about our body-mind needs. So that's on an individual level. But we also have to recognize that as a community, a lot of us have been bombarded repeatedly by harmful decisions that have been made, whether it has been to divest in certain community supports or whether it was to never invest in the first place. A lot of decisions that have been made have caused additional harm and have made it incredibly difficult to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. And so we want to have that conversation because all of that is really centrally connected to how we manage personal crises to global disasters or global pandemics, or even a disaster that affects you regionally. All of those things are connected. Next slide. So I just wanted to focus on the types of trauma, and I wanted to acknowledge that for all my public health and my mental health folks that are on the line. I always like to do to affirm and acknowledge that we are impacted by trauma in so many ways. And I spoke to Christian beforehand, and she mentioned that this series and other workshops that has been done in this series has gone far deeper on trauma. So I will not do that here. I just simply wanted to acknowledge that natural disasters can be a form of an acute trauma. Right, so a natural disaster can cause acute trauma. We want to be aware of that, and this is also something that could be related to a human cause crisis, such as a mass shooting, right? So that can cause acute trauma. Repetitive trauma could be caused by multiple medical visits for chronic illnesses, or perhaps multiple COVID tests that did not go well, and that was done in a way that was very forceful, or that caused additional pain. And so that could cause aspects of repetitive trauma. We can also think about this in terms of vicarious trauma. So witnessing traumatic situations that have impacted other individuals, or perhaps other individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities. This may entail individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities who were involuntarily institutionalized after a disaster, and witnessing that process, or witnessing individuals be condescended to or talked down to when trying to gain access to government supports and services, or watching news coverage of someone with an intellectual disability being shot down in the streets as a result of police brutality. A lot of the trauma can be absorbed vicariously in that way. So we want to just be aware of what that means, and how all of those things can be connected. And so I also just want to acknowledge also historical trauma, which relates to slavery and genocide. And then I also mentioned here intergenerational trauma, which is important. And I'll get into an example of that in just a few moments here. And again, I want to invite you, if you have had experiences related to this, or let's say you were in the midst of a disaster situation, or you found yourself in the middle of a crisis, whether it was personal or whether it was involving massive amounts of people, and you'd like to share a little bit of that commentary, feel free to do that in a somewhat confidential way by putting that up in the Q&A, or if you'd like to share it with the masses, please feel free to put that up in the chat box. If you have additional resources related to trauma, do not hesitate to throw that into the chat box as well, so that everyone can take that in. Again, a whole session, we're going to be providing collective access to one another as we go. Next slide. All right, so I mentioned a couple of causes of trauma, but I also just wanted to give just a few more. So we talked a little bit about racial profiling, police brutality. I also just want to talk about gaslighting and discrimination from government representatives or case managers or voluntary organizations during disasters. So this is really key when you're someone with an intellectual or developmental disability and you are trying to explain what has happened or how you've been impacted by a disaster, and someone diminishes what you have to say, or they dismiss you and they ask you who you're here with. Who else can I talk to, because they don't have the time or the patience to listen to your story, or they're trying to rush you because they don't want to spend the time to allow you to process your thoughts and your emotions so that you can effectively communicate and convey how you've been impacted by an emergency or by a disaster. That can cause additional forms of trauma. I also just want to acknowledge all of the folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities on the line who have multiple disabilities, right? And so we also want to avoid situations that can cause trauma, like invasive questioning, right? I have been on a conversation and several a meeting. I've been in many a meeting where someone who's a part of an official organization or agency will ask terribly invasive questions that are not at all related to what a person needs to convey in order to get support. So for example, we'll be going over the questionnaire to get someone signed up for services, and out of nowhere, the individual who is the worker, the organizational worker or the agency worker will ask, well, how did you lose that leg? Or what happened? Where'd that scar come from? right? So someone does not need to disclose their disability origin story, especially if it comes from a place of pain, especially if it comes from a traumatic event, and just in order to get access to maybe a $200 gift card, or access to sign up for federal services because they needed additional financial supports. No one needs to do that. Right now, someone may ask you a question in terms of were you hurt in the storm, or do you need additional medical assistance or something along those lines. But going so deep as to ask someone to convey, to compel someone to ask you, or to provide all of those detailed observations and reflections about how they acquired their disability, is absolutely unnecessary, and it can be deeply traumatic for some people. I've worked with veterans as well, and asking them to disclose certain stories about how they've acquired certain disabilities, or as they may describe it, just as injuries, can be terribly invasive, and it can be trauma inducing, and it's unnecessary for the most part. So I just want all of us to be aware of that, because that we should use that recognition of how trauma can be unearthed. We need to use that to inform how we interact with individuals who we're serving, especially individuals. For the purposes of this conversation, we're focusing on folks with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities. Then we also want to acknowledge that displacement can also cause additional trauma disruptions in support systems. There's a real lack of affordable and accessible and available housing options, right? So again, this is especially key for folks who may have several different types of disabilities or have low to no income. And so finding additional housing is typically a concern after a disaster. When you look at shelters, more often than not, once they're getting ready to close, and you think about some of the individuals you observe, just some of the individuals who are still there weeks or several days after a disaster, many of those people are folks with disabilities, right? And so unfortunately, this brings into play the potential for involuntary institutionalizations, and we certainly don't want that to happen. But sometimes folks are met with that response. I have been pulled to the side and have been asked the question, well, can we just put her in a group home? Well, can we just send her to a nursing home, because we need to close? It costs money to keep this place open. We need to close. So can we send her somewhere else, because she can't stay here? And I think what people fail to realize is that you can possibly get them into a place rather easily, but it may be unbelievably difficult for them to get themselves back out. And therein lies the problem. More often than not, and in many circumstances, it's not a temporary stay. It's not a day or two. Sometimes it may last weeks, it may last months, or it could even last years, depending on the rate of recovery for a particular community, or for an individual, or for a family. So we just want to be aware of those factors. We also just want to be aware of sex trafficking during disasters, or labor trafficking after disasters. I'm actually a part of the National Human Trafficking and Disability Work Group, and I'm hoping that in some point very soon we'll be able to create a subcommittee that specifically focuses on trafficking before, during, and after disasters. It's a conversation that I'd like to have, because it hasn't been a full focus as much as we'd like it to. So we're hopefully going to start having those conversations a bit more. If you have resources, if you have information, if you have examples, throw them up in the chat, throw them up in the the Q&A box. We want to hear about it. Gender-based violence, domestic violence, caregiver violence, all of these different issues have the potential to rise during disasters, right? Economic exploitation. We have individuals who are sometimes left in shelters by care workers or caregivers. Sometimes we've had instances where that has happened. In order to receive additional government supports or different additional donations, right? I was working in a shelter in Louisiana, and there was an young woman who I was working with there, and she told us that her aunt received her Social Security disability insurance check, her SSDI check, and told her that she needed to come to the shelter, and she would be supported by the folks in the shelter from that point onward, and that the folks in the shelter needed to be able to help her get additional FEMA money. And once she was able to get that money and additional Red Cross money, and once she was able to get those additional supports, then kind of get back in contact with the aunt. So it seemed as if there was an instance of exploitation happening there, right? The aunt was already receiving the additional finances and wasn't sharing that with this young woman, at least according to her story, but then was also putting that additional burden on her to go out and find additional resources and supports financially. So that's a concern. Also, exclusion and erasure can cause additional concern, can cause some additional trauma, right? Being repeatedly rebuffed every time you are trying to include yourself of the experiences of your community can be a traumatic experience, as well as medical ableism and racism, and we'll get into that in just a bit. But let me pause here for a moment. I want to pop over to Christian. Christian, have you been noticing any activity in the chat or in the Q&A box?
Yeah, there are some comments in the chat, and there is also a request that if you could slow down just a little bit.
Sure.
Great, thank you. So one question in the Q&A is, where do mental health issues lie on the spectrum of different disabilities protected under ADA or any other law policy?
Right. So those mental health considerations are also protected under the ADA. They're also protected under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So people with mental health disabilities are also protected under law.
And then there are some comments. I'm reading a similar book about trauma in children with intellectual disabilities, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and Other Stories from a Child Psychiatrist's Notebook. What traumatized children can teach us about loss, love, and healing. And there are a few other book suggestions in there as well.
All right, nice.
I don't have other questions. Elaine, is there anything from YouTube?
Nothing at this time.
Okay, thanks, Justice.
All right, fantastic. Just wanted to make sure we make space for all of those things. All right, great. All right. So we want to understand, even when I mentioned this in terms of medical racism, I think we're still at the bottom of this trauma slide. We want to understand this through the prism that structural systems not only impact mental health, but they can also impact physical health as well, right? So we just want to be mindful of all of those things. So let's move on now to the next slide. All right, I want to concentrate on the connections for just a second here. When I first began to lose my vision and I was taking activities and daily living courses, one of the things that the trainer taught me was that the difference between a problem and a crisis is time. And the woman could not have known that that quote would be the very thing that took me through my career in many ways, and that helped me out in terms of the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. This is exemplified in a couple of ways. So if you have 2 months to determine how 5 group homes are going to receive personal protective equipment for the possibility of a pandemic in the future, then it's a problem that you will ideally have enough time to solve, right? It's not an active situation, but you know, hey, something is happening on the other side of the world. I think I may want to prepare for that. I think that we don't have any protective equipment, but we see folks in other parts of the world who are utilizing protective equipment. That may be an issue. I'm going to try my best to kind of get ahead of this if I can. That's a problem, but that's a problem that you can have a discussion around. That's a problem that you have enough time to be proactive about, right? But that is an entirely different conversation if you're trying to get personal protective equipment within 24 to 48 hours for every group home and nursing home in your state during an actual pandemic. If that is the case, then it is a crisis, right? So the difference between a problem and a crisis is often time. The difference between a slow and a sudden emergency is time, right? And I'll get into that in a bit in just a second here, but this is kind of very intuitive. But kind of a slow emergency happens gradually over time. And we'll talk about some of the factors, and we'll take a more expansive view as to what a slow onset emergency could be versus a sudden emergency, right? So something that is happening very quickly in a very rapid pace, right? So that's different from a slow emergency, which takes a lot more time to kind of emerge. Structural violence exposes the harm caused by differences between people's potential reality and their actual circumstances. And we'll talk about that. But structural violence is often viewed as natural or normal, but it creates the optimal conditions for slow onset crises to emerge. And I'll talk about that. I'll explain that a lot, but I just want to connect these dots for you all here in terms of how all of these things kind of lead into the next thing and the next thing. Much of the damage and the destruction caused by disasters is directly related to some of the structural issues and decision-making processes, decisions that are made on behalf of the masses, right? Or that are made on behalf of many individuals, right? So I'm not just talking about the personal decisions, because too often when we talk about disaster preparedness, we talk about go bags, we talk about making yourself a plan, we talk about a checklist. And this discussion goes a bit beyond that. We're talking about structures here. We're talking about systemic change here, right? So we're going to go a little bit bigger than just the individual, putting the onus on the individual and saying, well, it's your problem that people that you are continuously harmed or you're continuously injured. That's a you issue, as if there are not structural systems afoot or at work that make it really, really difficult to be able to prepare and respond to disasters for individuals with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities. So we just want to be aware of all of those things. And we also want to acknowledge that people with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities are habitually excluded from decision-making spaces and positions, or discouraged from sharing their experiences or using their experiences to impact systemic change. And what I mean by that is that I work with several firefighters and first responders, and every now and again, I'll come across someone who will whisper in my ear, yeah, I have a developmental disability, or hey, I have autism, or hey, I have a learning disability. And no, I may every now and again get that. It is rare, but I may kind of get a hint of it every now and again. And then the question becomes, are you using that very lens to inform the work that you're doing, right? Because it could be one thing to occupy or to identify with a certain group that has been marginalized or disenfranchised. It's one thing to do that personally. It is another thing, though, to act on that from a professional perspective, right? So is that perspective going to be incorporated in the types of decisions you make as a firefighter, and the types of decisions you make as a police chief, and the types of decisions you make as an emergency manager? And too often than not, that isn't the case. And that's really why we're having this discussion here. One, there is not a lot of individuals with intellectual disabilities, to be sure, in decision-making positions involving public health, or involving emergency management, or involving fire safety, or humanitarian response, if we want to go global. And then also, when we have individuals in those positions, are they provided with enough space and enough grace to feel comfortable enough with utilizing those experiences to inform the ways that policies are shaped, the way the standard operating procedures are crafted, right? How we are actually intending to implement an emergency action plan or coordination moving forward. Are they utilizing those experiences to inform those types of decisions? And a lot of times that is not happening. And that's why we're having this type of discussion today. Next slide. So let's talk about structural violence for a second. And I'm going to bring in a voice actress who we hired straight out of Hollywood. Christian, that would be you. If you could read this whole definition of structural violence, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Structural violence refers to any scenario in which a social structure perpetuates inequity and causes preventable harm, injury, and/or death. It examines how economic, political, medical, and legal systems can have a disproportionately negative impact on marginalized groups and communities. These systems are misleadingly thought of as normal, natural, rather than harmful processes and forces that actively constrain individual agency. Lastly, it reveals the barriers that create differences between a group of persons' potential reality and their actual conditions.
Awesome. Thank you, Christian. I appreciate it. Straight out of Hollywood. All right. Now, I want to connect the dots for us a little bit. So structural violence is the difference between the actual and the potential, right? So the potential realization is related to insights and resources. So we have the potential to survive, right? People with intellectual and developmental disabilities have the potential to be in decision-making positions, yet in actuality, they are not. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities have the potential to be leading in different aspects in their communities, or in different positions in their community, or listened to in their communities, and in actuality, too often they are not. I am going to venture out and say that there are perhaps people on this call who have tried to express themselves at maybe a town hall meeting or a community meeting who has an intellectual disability, or perhaps knows someone with an intellectual disability and has been excluded in one way or another, but they have the potential to bring forth some wonderful insights that could really help the way things are shaped and done. And that's a concern, right? That's an issue, right? So that's a form of structural violence that we want to really think about, right? We want to think about how some of those resources continue to remain unavailable to individuals who are in marginalized groups, right? So if we have the insights and if we have the resources to avoid harmful conditions, and yet people with who are a part of marginalized groups are continued to be exposed to those harmful positions or those harmful impacts, then structural violence has occurred there, right? So we have the potential for individuals in group homes to receive additional supports throughout the coronavirus pandemic. And if that does not happen, then structural violence has occurred. So we have the insights, the resources exist in the world, right? We know that things like masks and gloves and other forms of personal protective equipment, depending on the activity that you're doing, that could really help alleviate the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. And if we have the resources are available in the world. In terms of, we know that masks exist. We have the mask exists in the world. We know that they're there, but yet they are not made available to individuals who are marginalized. So perhaps we're thinking about individuals who have intellectual or developmental disabilities, who are in nursing homes or who are in group homes or who are in community-based living and who just can't find access to the proper supports that they need. Then that is a problem, right? That is a form of structural violence, because our structures, our systems that are in place have figured out who is deemed most worthy of getting those supports quicker. So perhaps economically speaking, if you have additional money, you can just simply buy it and have it shipped in and do that in a way that's much quicker. We saw instances of that happening during the pandemic. Perhaps if you have enough political clout, right? That's another system. Perhaps if you have enough political clout, you can speak to somebody, whisper in somebody else's ear, your uncle works for this congressman, and maybe you can get the nursing home where your grandmother is placed, and you can get her some additional resources, or you can get them additional personal protective equipment, right? Or perhaps you work in a medical system and you know that you guys had kind of additional equipment that was available, you had some overflow, and you can make that available to another group. Then that's a problem, right? That's a problem in terms of it's an inequitable system for how people are receiving life-saving or life-sustaining supports, and that's an issue, right? So we want to talk about when the actual is avoidable, right? So actually people are dying, actually people are harmed, actually people are injured during disasters and crises. And when that can be avoided and it is not, then structural violence is present, right? So we just want to think about that. Involuntary institutionalizations after disasters, it is avoidable. So many of the COVID-19 related deaths were avoidable. Inaccessible access to information during disasters is avoidable. And yet all of these things have happened or continue to happen, and that is a form of structural violence. So let me just give you another example. When one caregiver perhaps takes the phone of someone with an intellectual disability or developmental disability as a means of keeping them away from critical information or supports. Now that's a form of interpersonal violence or perhaps caregiver abuse. However, when thousands of people with developmental disabilities repeatedly receive delayed or distorted information during disasters, that is a form of structural violence. Next slide. So let me just talk really quickly about structural violence and environmental racism. So we know that these things can be a cause and contributor to intellectual and developmental disabilities. It can also make a significant strain on mental health. We think about this in terms of lead-tainted water. Flint, Michigan would be an example, and how lead, of course, has an impact in hiring the prevalence of intellectual disability. So we think about that. A lot of times that happens in communities of color. And so we want to be mindful of what that means. There are decisions that have been made for economic purposes. So there was an emergency manager appointed in Flint and made decisions purely based off economics at the time. And this has all been reported. There's nothing that is really scandalous in this statement. But those decisions were made based off the finances, right? And so, but those types of decisions were being made, and of course it impacted the water. Those economic or those financial decisions were made. It impacted the water sources, and significant amounts of people of color were impacted by that, not to mention the children of those people of color. So that's really important to note. We think about toxic dump sites in communities of color and how that may play a role, not only in the mental health of people who live there, but then also in the development of children who live in those communities. You hear stories about children who are playing in toxic dump sites. Their playgrounds are right next door or kind of right across the street from toxic chemical dump sites. And these dump sites may have been active years and years ago, but the chemicals are still actively engaged in the ground. It can still cause harm. So that's a problem. We also think about this in terms of mold, vermin, poor ventilation in homes that have been dilapidated in low-income communities. Those things can certainly cause respiratory issues. It can also be fire safety concerns. And I actually work with a lot of fire safety individuals, officials, police, fire chiefs. And one of the major concerns that they tend to have is about slumlords or in unlicensed group homes as well, right? So these dilapidated properties that often have a tremendous number of safety hazards as well, but the individuals living inside them, let's say it's an unlicensed group home, the residents living inside them, individuals who may have intellectual or developmental disabilities, do not own those properties and thus don't have the authority or can't even afford to fix some of the problems involving exits and entry, involving holes in the roof or the vermin, right? So things like rats and roaches and how that can cause additional respiratory problems, right? But the ability to effectively evacuate, holes in the ceiling, also poor wiring in the building. And actually a project that I'll be working on next year will actually deal a lot with some of these issues. So I'm really looking forward to that, but that's also a concern. So we want to think about folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have a number of different living arrangements, right? So that's really important. All right, let's go ahead and head to the next slide. So we want to just acknowledge really quickly that the way we have shaped our economic, political, medical, and legal systems, they play some sort of role, whether it be big or small, in the existence of all of those environmental racism factors that I mentioned a few moments ago. Remember what we said earlier about time, is that all of these things in terms of those environmental racism issues, those are problems, but they can very well become crises or impede somebody's ability to effectively respond to or manage a crisis if they are left undealt with. So that's important. All right, now we're talking about slow onset emergencies. So structural violence is directly related to slow onset emergencies. So slow onset emergencies are gradual. They emerge over time. So traditional examples include drought, food insecurity, migration, climate change. But if we wanted to expand this definition just a little bit, so we're talking about crisis-like conditions that really just bubble up over time, or that create conditions that make it very difficult for you to respond to sudden events. We can expand our thinking around this to now include issues such as poverty, health inequities, carceral systems, educational inequities, racism, ableism, sexism, ageism, etc. The repeated and cyclical exposure to such events leave little room for recovery or for somebody to have the full capacity to prepare for sudden onset events, right? Such as flash floods, earthquakes, wildfires. And I wanna invoke the spirit of Toni Morrison here for a minute, if I can, and really acknowledge a quote here that she mentioned around racism. It's one of my favorites. And she says that racism is a distraction. And I would venture to also say that this is very much true around sexism and ableism and ageism, but she says racism is a distraction. It keeps us from doing our work or the things that we truly wish to do, and I'm paraphrasing here. It keeps us in a position of having to explain over and over and over our ways of being or our very existence. And so that's important as we think about all of the messages that come out and tell people, well, you need to prepare and you need to have a go kit that consists of hundreds of dollars worth of equipment or of medications that you can't even afford on a day-to-day basis. That is a problem, right? So we want to think about how all of these things, the very existence of racism and having to combat racism on a day-to-day basis keeps you from having the energy or the overarching capacity to have to deal with a slow onset crisis or a sudden onset crisis when it comes, right? It kind of keeps you from being in the optimal position to be ready and proactively engaged in a sudden onset disaster that may happen, like I said, like a home fire or a flash flood, right? So kind of telling people that they should prepare their homes and that they should prepare their properties and that they should prepare their families. We're not completely absolving people of personal responsibility, but we are being very honest here when we say that there are some additional factors and systems at play that make it very difficult to do that. And to simply ignore that is unbelievably, it causes additional problems, it causes additional harm for individuals who have to live in those positions, right? So we just want to be cognizant of that as we go. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. All right, so I want to continue our connections just a little bit because I just want to keep reiterating the different ways that these things are connected, because I know for some, many of you on this line perhaps are very familiar with some of these contexts. For others, it may be the very, very first time that you're seeing some of these things linked in this way. So I just want to make sure that for access purposes, we have different types of learners on the line that we just drill in one more time. The coronavirus pandemic has reminded us that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are frequently deemed as disposable or less worthy. We saw that in how policies were written in terms of who were going to receive ventilators and who was going to receive critical care. And the disability community and other civil rights groups had to really kind of come to the forefront and combat and challenge those policies that were brought forth by states, that were brought forth by government representatives. We had to really do a lot of advocacy around that. And the protection and advocacy agencies in particular were really at the forefront of a lot of those conversations, as well as a lot of other independent disability organizations and stills, so on and so forth. So I want to do shouts out to those folks who have been doing a lot of that work on the ground. I also want to just acknowledge is that lived experiences teaches us that individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are highly impacted by structural violence that is embedded in our medical, our legal, our political, and our economic systems. And such barriers create conditions for slow onset emergencies to develop, which makes it increasingly difficult to deal with sudden onset emergencies. Disability rights equips us with the legal frameworks to help us remedy disability discrimination during emergencies and disasters. So that's important. And disability justice urges us to make sure that people with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities are centered, engaged, empowered, and in power. So those are different things, right? So we don't want people to just feel as if they have the power to do things, but we want people to actually be in positions where they have the power to bring about change, right? So in any way that they define for themselves is very important. And that's all throughout disasters and emergencies, right? And that's really that second principle of disability justice that talks about disability, that talks about leadership by the most impacted, right? That second principle of disability justice. History compels us to reflect and learn and document the impact of previous disasters and emergencies on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I really just want to highlight that lived experiences point because so often it is thought that if it's not in a report, if it is not mentioned in an article, then somehow it is not valid. And that is a problem. And it is at the disadvantage of individuals with intellectual disabilities or perhaps developmental disabilities, whereby those might not be the most accessible forms of communication or of documentation, right? So we need to think about other creative means of making sure that we capture those stories, those narratives, and those experiences, and that is being incorporated into how we embark on emergency management moving forward. It's very important to acknowledge. Next slide. We're gonna get into some calls to action, but before I do, let me just pause for the calls. Kristen, do you have any questions or commentary that I need to be aware of?
We have a couple other requests to ask you if you will slow down a little bit.
Slow down. I speak so quickly. I'm on a roll and I just end up going. I'm also use a screen reader that's speaking so much quicker than I am, folks, so you can only imagine.
They are loving it. They're just trying to take notes too.
Also, for access purposes, let me just mention to everybody, please don't feel like you have to write everything down that's in this presentation. For access purposes, we are sending out this entire deck to you. So as a PDF, and Christian mentioned that at the beginning, and I should have re-emphasized it one more time, but you do not need to write down every single thing that's on these slides. I do want to make that clear for folks so that you're not so frazzled throughout, but I will also do my best to slow down. It's that spoken word poet in me. I feel like I should be at a poetry saloon to kind of going into some of these things, but I will do my best to slow it down just a little bit more. Anything else, Christian? Comments or stories?
That's all I have right now. Elaine, do you have anything?
No, we don't.
Okay, no. All right, sweet deal, no worries. All right, so now guys, we're closing out here. We're in our calls to action. So we just spoke about history a little bit. And I want to just recognize that histories of harm and survival strategies and coping methods, they should inform emergency management planning, right? So sometimes we'll look to, well, who has the most degrees? Who has the most years doing this work? And they'll be the people that we go to for all of the official words and the official perspectives on what we do moving forward. And that's a problem. That is a problem because there is intrinsic value in how my grandmother has survived. There's intrinsic value on how my aunts and how my uncles and how our communities have survived. Right, so we want to make sure that if there are survival strategies that have been led by people of color, that have been led by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that those are equally valued and that they inform what happens around disasters and emergencies, what coping methods were developed. Is that also in your after action? You know, we talk about all of the people who we lost, and that's important, and that needs to be at the very top and in terms of how we change that and how we shift it. And in order to have that conversation, perhaps we also need to go to the people with intellectual disabilities who survived it, or with developmental disabilities who survived the last disaster. What did you do? How did that work for you? What did you experience? Share that and make sure that is also in your report if you're a government worker or if you're a public health official, or if you're someone else who has any sort of involvement with this process. Make sure those things are equally valued. Disaster preparation should include conversations around power, privilege, and possibility. So we talked about power a lot, having the power to change things, having the power to change the rules, to be in decision-making positions, to have the power to determine how money is being spent. We want to talk about that. We want to talk about who is privileged and prioritized when it comes to rebuilding and recovery. Are our communities the last ones touched? Are we still going through and sifting through big piles of debris that's on our corners and that's on our sidewalks, making it virtually impossible for folks with wheelchairs to get through? Are our communities the last ones to receive supports? Right, so let's have that conversation around power and privilege, but then let's also not forget possibility. And possibility needs to also be defined by individuals with intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities, right? Not just people who, again, have been doing this work for years or perhaps has a certain number of degrees. I just think that's really, really important. Engagement around emergency management should include intentional outreach to self-advocates, advocates in Mad Pride movements, psychiatric survivors movements, undocumented folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, folks in group homes and institutions. That the level of engagement that happens needs to happen also in non-traditional spaces, right? So if you're doing this work as an emergency manager or public health official or government worker in some capacity, are you also reaching out to racial justice groups? Are you reaching out to LGBTQIA groups? Because there are folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities who perhaps are engaged and activated in those areas, but you won't see them as a formal member of a disability organization. I'm a Black lesbian. I have not been a part of any sort of disability organization throughout my entire teen and early 20s, right? But you could catch me in a Black lesbian book club, right? Like you could catch me in other, racial justice groups, right? You could catch me in community development meetings. You could catch me having those type of conversations and with those individuals. So let's move outside the traditional organizations and places that we go to reach out to individuals with disabilities, especially those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And this also applies to your hiring practices. So let's not just engage folks on the periphery, but how do we bring them into the center? Conversation is about the center. How do we do that? And let's make sure that they're a part of that process should they so choose. And we can have a whole other conversation about recruitment and retention. And I think we don't have the time for that now, but we need to be aware of that. Also advocate for justice. We're talking about disability justice here today, racial justice, educational justice, health and healing justice, inclusive food justice, etc. And remember that that is one of the disability justice principles as well, right? Cross movement solidarity, right? So how are we reaching out to all of these different movements again, so that we understand how all of these things are connected and how all of the different systems impact one another and impede someone's or community's capacity to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. So we want to make sure that we're reaching out to all of the folks who are working on different aspects of this conversation so that we can be in conversation with one another. Right, so that's really important. You don't need to be the expert. And that's the one thing I always tell people, because they get really scared when I mention this, when I say, well, you know, there's this group who's doing that, and there's that group who's doing this, or there's all of these different angles and lenses that you can use to look at this issue. And folks get really nervous. And I have to tell them, you don't need to be the expert. You just need to widen your lane. Just widen your lane. You don't need to switch lanes. And I really can't stand that metaphor, but for the purposes of this conversation, you don't need to switch lanes. You can just widen the lane. So if you do accessibility really good, reach out to the folks who are already working in inclusive food justice, or reach out to the folks who are working in racial justice and ask them, hey, is there anything that I can do to help make your spaces more accessible, especially when you're having conversations around disasters and emergencies. I also want to make sure that everyone has access to that information, that we put it in accessible formats, and that they can get it in a timely manner, right? So you can help be a part of that discussion. If you're a mental health worker and you're very well versed on trauma, then can you go to some of those other groups? Can you go to the health and healing justice groups, which may very well be your people? Can you go to the racial justice or the disability justice groups? Can you go to these other entities and say, hey, I just want to make my services available, especially during disasters and crises? You all did not receive a federal declaration down here in California, or out here in California, for some of these wildfires, but I know that people have been traumatized by it. I am not a wildfire expert, but I am an expert on trauma. Can I come in and can I make myself available to your organization? I know you have members that you serve who's been impacted. No, you're not a disability organization, but it speaks to reason that people with disabilities are a part of your organization, and I want to be there to help. Right, so those are conversations that could be had. And we want to help prevent erasure and exclusion, and we want to document and amplify those lived experiences, which we've already talked about a ton. And then we're on to the last slide. Remember that resilience is rooted in representation. We want to go beyond go bag, and we want to call for systemic change. And we talked about some of those systemic changes today. We want to monitor commercial investments that cause or contribute to environmental degradation, right? So again, we talked about some of those different economic decisions that are sometimes made that actually do additional damage to our communities, right? That's not a natural act. That's not something that just naturally happened. Those were decisions. Those were active decisions that were made to not invest in one thing, but to invest in another, right? And so if that is happening in your community, just be aware of that, because they may cause additional degradation that make disasters more destructive to communities, or additional flooding in communities, or they may cause architectural barriers. We want to advocate against climate gentrification. So this may happen if a community is highly impacted by a disaster, and all of a sudden you have a totally different class bracket who sees this as a place where they can come in and redevelop and kind of move other folks in and keep those other folks out. They're already gone, they've been displaced, and they don't need to come back. That's a problem, right? You saw a lot of activism around this in Puerto Rico. following Hurricane Maria, when several developers wanted to come in and make Puerto Rico kind of their distant or their second headquarters. And that would have completely displaced so many historical communities, because Puerto Rico has a lot of historical communities in areas and locations and sites, but communities that have been in place and families that have been there for generations, but would displace all of those individuals. And there was a lot of protest around that, right? And that also led to some leadership change. And that happened after Hurricane Maria, right? So disaster survivors have the right to return to their community. We want to focus on that. We want to mobilize to direct funding towards community-driven mitigation measures related to accessible shelters and green mitigation measures and sustainable drainage. And we also want to make sure that folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities are a part of defining what is accessible. So we may want to go beyond just, okay, physical access, right? Which are some of the things that you'll find in the Department of Justice's shelter access checklist. So we might want to go beyond that now and start having conversations around quiet rooms and making sure that when a city or a state is stocking up for their supplies for a disaster, that also includes sensory bags, right? And that could be filled with whatever local organizers deem to be the most effective for people in that area, right? Or their own community, right? So we want to, why is that outside the realm of possibility? I'm here to tell you that it isn't. And so we want to advocate for those things as well. We want to insist that people with disabilities are fully integrated into community risk reductions, plans, and assessments as well, right? And we want to acknowledge that integration differs from desegregation, right? So desegregation may mean that, okay, we'll bring you into the room. We will no longer kind of separate you out or put up these barriers where you can't physically be here. So we think about that often in terms of school segregation, right? But that doesn't often equate to integration. Integration means that you now have equitable access to power, right? So again, I'm weaving in power every single step of the way, because sometimes folks will say, well, we included these folks. We brought them into the room, but you brought them in as bystanders. You brought them in perhaps as witnesses, but you did not bring them in as people who had the power to actually change the rules or to say, this is not going to happen because it causes harm, or we're going to stop this and we're going to put in additional measures to help mitigate the problems and the harms that have been caused by what we've done in the past. So you aren't appointing people or putting people or allowing people to have access to those particular frames of power, but instead you're saying you're in the room, there's a brown face there, or there's several people here who have intellectual disabilities. They're here, we've listened to them, but that's not the same as making sure that these same folks are integral to how things are done. I just cannot say that enough. We also want to urge both funders and government folks to support mutual aid programs and other forms of community response efforts, because that's really important. So these are things that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have dreamed up for themselves, not some sort of playbook that has been handed to them from some other external or outside entity, but what have the local folks themselves decided? What have they come up with? Are there strategies that they've created? Mutual aid has been explosive during the coronavirus pandemic in the best of ways in terms of providing immediate relief and support for people in need. So how can we make the conditions more conducive for those types of effective remedies to flourish even more in the future? Community-driven, community-created responses to disasters and emergencies. How can we figure out additional ways to amplify those types of successes? All of these are different attributes and factors that we want to be cognizant of as we strive from this point moving forward to center individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities during disasters. With that, I'm going to close. I'm going to open it up for questions or discussion, depending on where we are for time. Kristen, I'm going to bring it over to you.
Okay, we're a little over time, so I'd just like to thank everybody for being here and say that we're going to continue on. If you are available to stay, we understand. If you need to go, we'll stay for the Q&A and we'll record it, and it will be included with the recording on YouTube. Okay, so let me see. Here's a question. What advice do you have when engaging with emergency managers to help them understand the intersections and inequities that exist when their solution is always putting the onus on individuals to be personally prepared?
Yeah, I would say that they need to start having conversations not only with the communities themselves, but also with other people who are in government positions. I would also encourage that the onus of educating those emergency managers not be put on the community. Because remember what I said about Toni Morrison, right? Is that like racism is a distraction and ableism is a distraction, and it keeps you in a position of having to constantly explain the reason for your existence or constantly explain the reason for your conditions over and over and over again. So I don't even want to thrust that responsibility for having to continuously educate emergency management officials on the community themselves. But if you choose to, by all means, please do so. You are the optimal option for making sure that message is clear. We're going to amplify your voices. But then also, if you have other individuals who work in governmental agencies and said, listen, I work a lot on poverty reduction. I'm telling you, these different issues that folks are dealing with, it makes it very difficult for them to prepare for these disasters that are happening. So can we have conversations about moving beyond that? Can we collaborate on a project or an initiative that focuses on perhaps one neighborhood or a couple of different neighborhoods? Can we pilot something that the community has brought forth, or that can we work with the community, not doing something for the community, but doing it with the community? Shout out to Nothing About Us Without Us. But can we have this conversation in tandem with the community to determine what type of methodology would be best moving forward to acknowledge poverty and to acknowledge some of the gaps in our medical system, right? Any whatever factor, whatever structure is holding that community or those individuals back from fully participating in disaster preparedness, that should be at the forefront. And bringing in other individuals who work on those issues and work on those problems on a day-to-day basis may be very helpful in moving you forward. It may also, again, take a little bit of that burden off of the community having to constantly proclaim the very existence of some of these structural problems.
Thank you. Okay. How should a family go about getting involved in their community to make a strong impact? My son is 14 and IDD, and we live in a medium-sized community, and I want him to be a strong self-advocate.
Hey now, I would say let's look for the advocates in your community, right? So let's do some searching to see if there's a local organization or if there's a national organization that perhaps has a local chapter or affiliate. Depending on where you are, sometimes chapters of different organizations may be in different cities, or they, maybe in different parts of your region. But I would say start off with doing those searches, and sometimes it's not even a formal organization or entity. Sometimes it's just putting the word out there on Facebook or Twitter and saying, hey, I'm starting up a group. Does anyone want to join? And I know that may seem a little naive to some folks, but I'm telling you this from a place of experience. I literally wanted to provide more support for blind women of color. I called up another friend who is a blind woman of color. I said, I want to do this. We put the word out on Twitter and Facebook, and we just said, hey, we're gonna get together on a call. And that group now consists of nearly 100 blind women of color from all across the country who felt very similarly to me. And that wasn't a formal group that was already there. It was just something that we created. Right? Just in terms of connecting with the folks around you. And people who do disability justice will often tell you that disability justice can just be 2 or 3 folks getting together, deciding that they want to do something to and help themselves or to help their communities or to do something that's going to help the nation or whoever they have their goals or their sights set on. But it does not have to be a massive amount of people. So I just want to alleviate that burden on you. You can do this in a number of creative ways.
Elaine, do you have questions from YouTube?
No, I don't.
Okay, we have one that's more of a recommendations for suggestions. I have a client who has frontal lobe damage due to brain surgery. Her son is having trouble understanding that he can't do the things he did prior to COVID. Do you have suggestions for how he can understand? He was an investment banker, so after his surgery, he's had some major changes.
Yeah, I'm going to invite folks who work on traumatic brain injury or people who work in this space. If you have recommendations, I really would like to pivot over to you. And I mentioned this in the beginning, if we can provide collective access for one another, if you know of resources or if you know of different supports for this individual, I want to pivot over to you. And if that person is not able to receive any direct recommendations, I do have a colleague who focuses on this issue in particular, and I can maybe connect with him after this session.
Okay, great. Thanks, Justice. So drop those in chat and we can follow up. And then I think the last question is really just around the books that you mentioned, the women you mentioned, the videos you mentioned. If you could just make any other suggestions, people would really like to read some of the things and look at some of the things that you're looking at.
Now y'all done got me started. This is unfortunate. All right, so here we go. I want to mention Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice by Leah Lakshmi Peepsna Samrasinghe. And I know I'm not saying that all the way correctly, but that book quite literally changed my life when it comes to the way that I organize, the way that I work, the way that I connect, the way that I build, the way that I dream, not only about myself personally, but about my communities and about the prospects of what can be done in the future. So it's an incredibly powerful and beautiful book. I would also encourage folks to check out Skin, Tooth, Bones, a disability justice primer, and that's by Sins Invalid. You can go on Sins Invalid's website and download it there. I really believe it's only like $5 or $10 or so. So that is another really great read. Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong, is out, and also a phenomenal book, and that came out not too long ago. So that was really wonderful. In terms of additional books around mental health, there is a book that's called I'm Telling the Truth, But I'm Lying, and that is by Bassie Igby. And that one was also just beautifully written. A Black woman with mental health considerations who was also or is also a spoken word poet. So, you know, I was all about it. And it's just gorgeously written, and it tells a lot of these stories and a lot of these narratives, which is really awesome. And there are really too many to name because I could literally just keep going on. But what I think I will also do, perhaps, Christian, is just send you maybe my top 10 in a follow-up message so that you can include it for folks and they can go look it up. Buy from local booksellers, folks, if you can. They really need the support during this pandemic. So if you're looking for some of these books, please choose to go there and support.
We would love to have that. And I've tried to keep up with some of them and the website you said as you were speaking. So we've got a few in the chat, but I think having a follow-up list would be great.
Absolutely. I'd be more than happy to provide that for additional access.
Okay, well, I think that closes us out. I want to thank everybody for coming and for staying. And Justice, thank you so much for this webinar. We really appreciate it. And thank you for your time. We're going to post our email at the end. You will get a follow-up email that will have information regarding continuing education, a link to where you can find the recording, information to contact us or our website. So everybody who registered will receive that. Thank you, everyone, and thank you especially, Justice. Have a fantastic afternoon.